Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. In the previous lectures, we talked about the Vietnamese experience during World War II and the moment at the end of the war, the August Revolution, in which the Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh finally thought they had achieved independence. In this lecture, we'll pick up the story from there and discuss the restoration of French control in Vietnam and the resulting French Indochinese War. Recall, as we mentioned at the end of the previous lecture, that the Viet Minh called for a national revolution and seized control of local governments throughout the country of Vietnam on August 29, 1945, the August Revolution. The Viet Minh formed a provisional government with a capital in Hanoi, and independence was declared. This independence was not to endure. France ultimately moved to reestablish their Indochinese colonies. There were a number of reasons for this, even though France had been badly beaten during World War II and was somewhat downtrodden as we begin this story. But there were economic considerations, the need to rebuild in the aftermath of the war, and colonies were an important element of that. There was also a psychological factor. France had long considered itself a great power, and yet was badly beaten during World War II. Psychologically and emotionally, the nation needed to restore its sense of dominance and power. And finally, in France, there was a theory similar to the American domino theory that was sometimes called the 10-pin theory. If Indochina fell, and they lost control, and the communists took over, then it might inspire rebellion in other and more important colonies, like Morocco, Tunisia, or Algeria. The French really didn't take very seriously Vietnamese claims to independence. According to the provisions of the Potsdam Conference of July 1945, Chinese troops would supervise Vietnam north of the 16th parallel, and British troops south of the 16th parallel. These troops moved in September of 1945, and the so-called independence of the August Revolution was swept aside. British troops under General Douglas D. Gracie marched into Saigon on September 13, 1945. Gracie cracked down harshly on any disorder and declared martial law. He ordered the disarmament of all Vietnamese forces and the release of all French soldiers imprisoned by the Japanese. These forces were then armed and helped to subdue Vietnamese resistance. Saigon was under French control again by late September 1945. As an aside, it's during this period that the first American soldier to die in Vietnam was killed. A man named A. Peter Dewey. He had paratrooped into Tonkin during World War II to fight the Japanese. He now remained to help subdue the Viet Minh, although during the war he had met Ho Chi Minh and didn't particularly favor the French. Dewey was killed on September 26, 1945, while driving a jeep, fired upon by Viet Minh soldiers. That very day, he had written in his diary, "Cochin China is burning. The French and British are finished here, and we ought to clear out of Southeast Asia." It is somewhat fitting that from the very first American death in Vietnam, there are these lingering questions of what are we doing here? Is this worth sacrificing American lives? Continuing resistance by the Vietnamese led Gracie to release and rearm the Japanese soldiers who remained in South Vietnam. In the fall of 1945, British, French, and Japanese, armed with American weapons, pacified South Vietnam. As more French soldiers arrived, the British and Japanese troops were phased out, and by early 1946, the entire effort was left to the French. The French general, Jacques-Philippe Leclerc, controlled Cochin China by February 1946, with continued resistance by Viet Minh forces. While Ho Chi Minh supported this resistance in spirit, he could do little to support them otherwise, as he was preoccupied with the Chinese presence in the north. In carrying out the Potsdam Agreement, Chiang Kai-shek sent an army of 180,000 troops, commanded by General Liu Han, into Tonkin in September 1945. Chinese troops moved village to village, replacing any Viet Minh leadership they discovered with non-communist Vietnamese nationalists. They also looted and plundered as they went, angering the Vietnamese. Ho Chi Minh was confronted with a Chinese takeover in the north and a French takeover in the south. These were difficult times for the Viet Minh. They resorted to bribery of Chinese officials in the north to alleviate their occupation, making rich men of General Liu Han and his friends. Ho Chi Minh also joined with other nationalist groups and downplayed the communist leanings, dismantling for a time the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese were frankly more interested in gaining concessions from the French than from occupying Vietnam. The United States also urged China to facilitate French reoccupation. In February and March 1946, the Chinese and French signed a series of agreements, under which the French gave up all their pre-war trading rights and concessions in China, and the French were allowed to re-enter and assume control in North Vietnam. The French, though, were not powerful enough to reoccupy North Vietnam without permission from the Viet Minh. General Leclerc noted that the war would be difficult, if not impossible, to win. He said, "Fighting the Viet Minh will be like ridding a dog of its fleas. We can pick them, drown them, and poison them, but they will be back in a few days. France is no longer in a position to control by arms an entity of 24 million people." It was better, in his view, to negotiate some kind of settlement. Thus, the French and Ho Chi Minh engaged in peace talks, and in March of 1946, they signed an agreement. It was rather ambiguous, but among its provisions, Ho Chi Minh's government was declared to be a, quote, free state within the French Union, with its own government and army. It was also determined that France would hold a national referendum to determine the status of Cochin China, whether they would unify Vietnam or remain separate. And also, and perhaps most importantly, 25,000 French troops were allowed to replace the Chinese north of the 16th parallel, with the understanding that they would withdraw in 5 years. Ho Chi Minh agreed to this treaty primarily to get the Chinese out of Vietnam. He answered those who criticized the treaty by saying, "Don't you realize what it means if the Chinese remain? Don't you remember your history? The last time the Chinese came, they stayed 1,000 years. The French are foreigners. They are weak. Colonialism is dying. The white man is finished in Asia. But if the Chinese stay now, they will never go. As for me, I prefer to sniff French shit for 5 years than to eat Chinese shit for the rest of my life." But the French really didn't honor this agreement. They re-established control, and the first point didn't amount to any real power anyway. The referendum was never held, but French troops did reoccupy North Vietnam. As a final note, Stalin and the Soviets didn't help Ho Chi Minh either. The Soviets were stretched thin in trying to control many parts of the globe, and they too were relatively weakened in the aftermath of World War II. Also, Ho's dismantling of the ICP and emphasizing his own nationalism made him appear to Stalin as an unpromising communist leader. And there was still the possibility that communism might prevail in France, where the Communist Party was the second largest party. So Stalin acquiesced in allowing the French to retake Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was pretty much alone at this point. He received no backing from China or the Soviets. He went to France in the summer of 1946 to discuss terms and try to get them to honor their earlier agreement. At the same time, He tried to get United States support and was rebuffed. The French refused to consider Vietnamese independence. On September 14, 1946, Ho told French officials, "If we must fight, we will fight. You will kill 10 of our men, and we will kill 1 of yours. Yet in the end, it is you who will tire." Ho Chi Minh said of this impending war, "It will be a war between an elephant and a tiger. If the tiger ever stands still, the elephant will crush him with his mighty tusks. But the tiger will not stand still. He will leap upon the back of the elephant, tearing huge chunks from his side, and then he will leap back into the dark jungle, and slowly the elephant will bleed to death. That will be the war in Indochina." He was right. In our next lecture, we will talk about this war between the elephant and the tiger.